Nisambulo Pinaka. Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us on this joint webinar that has been promoted by the World Council of Churches and the Pacific Conference of Churches. A special greetings to our guest speakers, Reverend Dr. Cliff Bird, Alice Herfa, Anis Saiki, and Daphne Kiki. I would like to extend our greetings as well to all the audience joining us today. My name is Francis Namomo. I am the programs coordinator at the Pacific Conference of Churches. And I'm very delighted to have been tasked to moderate today's webinar titled Reweaving the Ecological Mat, Pacific Voices for a New Creation. Now, before we go into the formalities of the presentation of the Reweaving the Ecological Mat by our guest speakers, for the audience, maybe I'll just take us through the order of the webinar. We will, right after this, there will be a short or brief introduction of the Reweaving the Ecological Mat. Then we will, this is followed by the introduction of our speakers, who will then share their opening remarks. Once they've done their opening remarks, as a moderator, I will pose a question, general question for the speakers to respond to. We're also fortunate today to have friends from other regions who will share brief comments and responses from their own context: Latin America, Caribbean, North America, Africa, and Asia. This is followed by a discussion session or question and answer session. Then we will round up our webinar with final remarks from our guest speakers and a poem to be read by Daphne Kiki, who is also representing the REM youth on this webinar. I hope this will guide our webinar today. For those of you who have just joined us now, again, hello, Bulavinaka, and welcome. Briefly, as an orientation to this, the topic of today's webinar, the Reweaving the Ecological Mat, this is an initiative or a movement that seeks an alternative narrative that challenges the age-old position that all that exists is simply to serve human civilization. According to the preceding Secretary General of the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, Dame Meg Taylor, Reweaving the Ecological Mat reaffirms the need to consider the full cost of development beyond its contributions to the gross domestic product of individual states. That is, the importance of considering its cost on our cultural values, social well-being, preservation of our natural environment, with emphasis on the sacredness of our ecology. The RAM initiative concerns itself with the economical aspects of development. Economical, a word coined by the think tanks behind this framework, describes the economical, ecological, and ecumenical as integral and interconnected aspects of the household of Pacific peoples. Now, without further ado, as I understand our guest speakers have more to share regarding REM, I would like to remind us some housekeeping guide before we give the floor to our presenters. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the chat box. I will bring them up during the presentation if necessary, or we will also have time for question and answer towards the end of the session. To keep the quality of sound during the webinar, as was reminded to us earlier, kindly mute yourself when you're not sharing. And also, please remember to unmute before you share anything. I hope that would help us as we now give the floor for our guest speakers to present their opening statements. First, I would like to welcome our first presenter, Reverend Dr. Cliff Bird. Reverend Dr. Cliff Bird is a Pacific academic and theologian. He spent many years serving in the ecumenical family in Oceania and beyond. Reverend Dr. Cleave is an ordained minister in the United Church in Solomon Islands and currently is volunteer advisor to his home church. He is founder and principal consultant researcher of UMI Global Consultants. Reverend Dr. Bird is a seasoned fisherman and loves to romance theology and its place and function in development and in the public sphere. He is happily married to Sarah Bird, and they have 5 children and 4 grandchildren. Reverend Dr. Cleave Bird, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Francis. And hello to the other speakers and to all of you who are part of this webinar. It is indeed an honor for me to be invited to be part of this very important webinar. As our moderator has given us a very brief rundown of the background to this webinar, the Reweaving the Ecological Map project has ended up with the publication of the Ecological Framework for Development. And I would like, my role here is to basically to outline the theological framing that underpins and undergirds Reweaving the Ecological Map and the Ecological Framework for Development. First of all, just to say that the Pacific churches or churches in Oceania have decided this way to go way back in 2018 during a conference in Nandi, Fiji, that this is an important direction that the churches of the Pacific would like to take, particularly in view of the development, the forms of developments, the kinds of development, economic developments that are happening in the region. And the decision was made to frame this Reweaving Ecological Map, and in particular the Ecological Framework for Development, to frame it theologically. And that is primarily because we in Oceania, the churches in Oceania, see Christianity and see faith as a very integral part of living and existence, and therefore the importance of having this project with a theological framework. And so the team that was put together to do the research and writing into this project have decided, together with the think tank in Suva, that at the very beginning of this project and the document that was published, the book that was published, will be the ecological theological framing for the work. And I would like now to highlight the 4 main, you might say, pillars or the bedrock that forms, that underpins the Reweaving the Ecological Map. And these for us are critical to taking into consideration, particularly as we weave ourselves toward a new future and a movement has begun. And the very first of these theological pillars is the fact, the truth that all of life is interconnected. We call this the interconnectedness of all life. When we look at the hills, the mountains, the seas, the valleys, the rivers, we look at the seas, our immediate environments, we look everywhere, we underpin this importance of the interconnectedness of all life. And this is a very rich theological foundation upon which this framework is developed. And interconnectedness of all life is very much a biblical idea, but also it is rooted in our traditional cultures, the religious and cultural worldviews of Pacific people. And we see this interconnectedness of life if we go back to the Genesis creation, particularly in chapter 2, where life is presented as a web in that particular chapter. And academics, theologians in the region continue to talk about that all life is interconnected. And this is where we begin to build the theological framework for this ecological framework for development. The second pillar that we use is the concept of home. Earth as being home to God, Earth as being home to humanity, and Earth as being home to all creatures. And so in the region, we have the various words that are very similar that describe this concept of home. And we build upon, we connect this idea of home to oikos. And this is to our moderator, the economical aspects of development. And in this idea of home, the interconnectedness of oikos nomos, which is economics, and oikos logos, ecology, and oikomene, which is ecumenical in human relationships, but goes beyond human relationships. And so in our theological framing, we see this idea of home as very, very important. The connection between what happens in our economical life to what happens in the ecological life and to what happens in the ecumenical as human beings relate to one another. These are all crucial and fundamental to the idea of what it means to be home. And in the region, for example, we have various very similar concepts. In Fiji, it's called the Vanua. In Tonga, it's called the Fonua. In Samoa, it's Fanua. In Maori, it's Wenua. In Maohi, Tahiti, it's Whenua. This idea that it's called a oceanic balance that goes beyond just language and brings together in a very strong way this idea that home is important. And home as being an interconnectedness between economics, ecology, and human beings. The third pillar that we build our theological aspect of this project is on the reign of God that we find in the Gospels, on the reign of God. And we believe and emphasize very strongly that the reign of God, more popularly known maybe as the kingdom of God, it needs to be earth, or it needs to be grounded. And so when we talk about God's reign, we are talking about God's reign as for the earth, and taking seriously the parables in Matthew chapter 13, where all the images there that are used in the parable about the kingdom of God, that earthly images on the land, images in the sea, images in the ground, and even images in the air, like birds, for example. All of these are what form the basis of the parables, the 7 parables of the reign of God, the kingdom of God in Matthew chapter 13. And therefore, the need to ground, the need to bring home what this means, and not to keep procrastinating it or just evacuating it as if it has nothing to do with the present, but everything to do with the future. We would like to shift the attention and the focus and the narrative of the reign of God, that it is for the earth, as we pray in the Lord's Prayer every single day. And so this is where our third important pillar. And the final one, not the last, the final one that we emphasize in our theological framing towards a new creation is fullness of life. I'm aware that global ecumenical organizations like the Council for World Mission has this as its theme that runs across decades, fullness of life. And in this fullness of life, we emphasize that fullness of life goes beyond the mere spiritual aspect of it and touches the very physical and the material aspects of life. So we also look at fullness of life and would need to ground it in people's existential experiences. And so in fullness of life, we include things like food, clean water, shelter, home, meaningful work, things like freedom to make informed choices, so inclusion and participation, health, dignity, respect, safety, and protection, and all of these kinds of very important areas in life. We see that fullness of life goes beyond going to church to pray, to worship, to sing. It goes beyond this. While these are important, we would like to emphasize and see that fullness of life includes all of this that I've mentioned. And therefore, this kind of understanding of fullness of life connects with the environments, connects with the land, connects with the sea, connects with the air. These understanding connect with our immediate environment, and we see the immediate environment also as symbolic of the grace of God, or what we call here as the manner of God for people in this part of the world. And so fullness of life is linked to where we live, to where we are, because without it, life as we experience it would be very, very different. And so these are the four pillars that we use to framing our Reweaving the Ecological mat. And so I think I'll end there to give my colleagues the opportunity to speak their portion as well. Thank you very much, moderator.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Cliff Bird, for sharing your valuable insights with us today. Reminder again of the interconnectedness in the way we live to our environment and also with our God. Our second speaker is Alice Herfer, who works as an arts and culture consultant in Fiji and the Pacific Islands. Formerly she was the culture advisor at the Pacific Community, Secretariat of the Pacific Community and Intergovernmental Regional Organization, providing technical advice on cultural policy, cultural industries, and heritage to Pacific Island countries. Prior to joining SPC, Alice was an associate professor at the University of the South Pacific. She is vice chair to the Oceania of the IUCN Commission on Environmental, Economic, and Social Policy. Welcome, Alice Herfer. Floor is yours.
Naka Francis, good morning, good evening. We're all in different time zones, so wherever you are, thank you for joining us. So as I understand my task this evening, it's really to talk more about the ecological framework for development, how it's structured and what its purpose is. So what Cliff spoke about was one component of the framework to set the theological basis for this framework. So I'm just going to take a step back because there's three components to this framework. One is theological, one is the ecological accounting, which our colleague Arnie Psyche is going to be talking about, and then there's the cultural dimension. So the purpose of putting together this ecological framework for development for the Pacific is to really relook at what's important to Pacific peoples and where we've collectively strayed, I think, over the last maybe 30 years, and particularly probably in the last 10 to 15 years, where we've followed global trends, where we've seen rising inequalities between countries, within countries. We've seen a deterioration of the care for the environment, really prompted by the economic model that's been adopted globally and therefore also regionally and nationally. So one of the issues that we know needs to be reviewed or globally as well as regionally and nationally is GDP, how we measure growth, how we measure well-being. So the ecological development framework, I guess, is part of a global rethinking of what sort of development do we really want for the planet in view of the ongoing destruction of the planet. We, in Fiji, we just had sort of 2 successive cyclones. We're probably going to have another one. We've seen COVID globally. And what we found in the Pacific is actually that what has sustained people through COVID is their ways of doing things themselves, relying on their land. So when Cliff was talking about Vanua, Whenua, Fonua, Whanua, that has been the key to people's resilience during this COVID period, where the whole global economy and national economies have had to shift completely. And so the reason I raise that is that what's happened globally with COVID has made our work, I believe, even more important, because the survival and well-being of communities in the Pacific has depended on people's relationships with each other, people's relationships with the environment, and their ability to come together communally for collective well-being. And really, the ecological development for the ecological framework for development is really about that, is about bringing everything back together that's been through economic development models and how we measure, how currently we measure growth and supposed economic well-being, has actually disconnected people from what's important. And even within the churches, there's, and I think this is the originated, how the framework originated and how the need for this originated, was the pastors, churches are seeing this growing disconnection within communities, increasing health issues within communities, increasing violence. We have huge levels of domestic violence and unhealthy relationships between people that have just been increasing, or at least we're a lot more aware of them. So when we're relooking at development, it encompasses all of that. It encompasses people's ability to feed themselves, to provide for their families, to live healthy lives, to live in harmony with their environment, and to be able to set the priorities of what's important to them as communities and as countries and as a region. So I think really the basis for this framework has been to, let's do a rethink what's really important to Pacific peoples and communities, and what can we collectively as a region put together to say to the rest of the world, these are the parameters within which we want to see development in the future. So I think I'll stop there, and then we can maybe have more discussion, especially after Arnie has presented ecological accounting, which is one of the 3 pillars of this ecological development for ecological framework for development, which is theological, cultural, and economic, but in a different way than what we've been, I get in some ways subjected to for the past, maybe 20 years, or has really increased. The damage has really increased over the last 20 years. So I'll just leave it at that, and then maybe we can have more discussion later. Naka.
Thank you very much, Alice, for those strong views on the perimeters that we are putting up to guide or to protect or to define the development discussion here in the region, the measurement of growth or well-being, and what that looks like for us here in the Pacific. So thank you once again for your contribution. For our third speaker is Ani Saiki. Bola Ani. Ani is a writer, activist, and organizer focusing on regional economic and geopolitical themes in the Asia and Pacific regions. He was the coordinator for the Moana Nui conferences and has been campaigning on issues around trade, development, militarization, and the environment in the Pacific. He currently resides in California with his wife and children. Welcome, Ani. The floor is yours.
Aloha, everyone. Hi, thank you, I'm Arnie Saiki, and thank you, Athena and Francis, for organizing this and including me in this webinar. It's really good seeing the team again. I am in Los Angeles, and COVID-19 has kind of kept me in the house for almost 10 months now, so it's good to be here with you now. I'm part of an independent working group on data statistics and valuation, working on this ecological economic accounting system that we call Intemerate Accounting. And it is such an honor to be involved with Reweaving the Ecological MAT team and to participate in this process. So I guess first off, Intemerate means pure, inviolate, and sacrosanct. And Intemerate Accounting is predicated on this notion that our ecological biodiversity is existential and as such cannot be valued as a commodity. What can be valued, however, are the offsets. And this is what the Intemerate equation measures. And so by referencing these scientific or even non-scientific data, it's straightforward enough to determine what the historical ecological baselines are or could be, and then measure the current offsets. And once we have this data, we then begin to value that restoration, and all those data points in between derives value by measuring our interaction with each other and our environment. And that is the foundational principle behind the Intemerate accounting scheme. And so, we are in a time right now that we are all kind of seeking solutions to this, planet in crisis. And as evident, the world is clearly in fluctuation. And while most of us have put the coronavirus pandemic at the forefront, dealing with the social and economic aftermath, the crisis of climate change looms much, much larger. And if anything, this pandemic feels like a warm-up of something much worse coming around the corner. And that's a terrible burden to carry, a terrible burden to place on our future, on our children. So if I may, I'm setting the clock back a year to before the pandemic. I want to quickly recall that the neoliberal economic system was already in turmoil. National public debt had long surpassed the 90% debt to GDP threshold for the advanced economies. And then many of the developing economies had already begun to shift their attention towards China and the Belt and Road Initiative because it provided a much fairer alternative than the Western counterparts, So for the West, the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated any notion of an economic recovery. And while COVID-19 may be blamed for our current economic woes, we have to remind ourselves that the economic downturn really happened in 2008 with the Wall Street financial collapse, and how the larger economies remained solvent was through debt vehicles like quantitative easing, of which trillions of dollars were pumped into the system. But of course, that's all, because of time, I'll just leave the economic reading there. And if there are any disputes, we can come back to that later. I just want to make clear that we understand that COVID-19 was not a catalyst for our economic downturn, but rather a symptom of something far more structural. So moving past that, as we look for solutions to fix our economic and ecological crises, we have an opportunity to fix the interactions between our ecology and economy, something that both Cliff and Elise brought up, and understand that they are absolutely and fundamentally intertwined. We can no longer afford to talk about our economy as something divorced from ecology. We need to be clear in the case of our planet that our ecology works. millions of years of evolution has created an ecosystem of mutual interactions. And for thousands of those years, maybe hundreds of thousands, humans have developed a notion of economy, of trade, infrastructure, and supply chains that interacted with the world. So what is ecological works? And that is the fundamental by which we should be measuring our economies, our laws, our trade, infrastructure, and supply chains, not the other way around. It is simple enough to trace the evolution of law and economic principles, and we can readily pinpoint the moments in history when industry-friendly governments promoted these laws above the laws of nature. So when we look for solutions to fix our existential crises, why do we turn to these long outdated economic models that have created these crises to begin with? But of course, the crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and the threats to our ecological sustainability are much greater than either the coronavirus or collapsing economic failures, as climate change is long-term, fundamental, and existential, and cannot be fixed with a vaccine. Now, some of you probably know the long-awaited Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity was just published by the Crown, and it confirms what most of us know about the ecology and the economics and the science behind it. For those who are here, I think we're all on the same page, and the question we should be asking is why it took so long to finally acknowledge that we need to change our economic system if we are to survive a planetary climate collapse. And so reading through some of the sections yesterday, especially the options for change section, the intemperate accounting model checks off many of the boxes, but does so without further alienating peoples and their interactions with their environments or each other. In other words, what we may have produced is a just, fair, and equitable accounting scheme that is not based on, what I would call on eco-neoliberalism. And this does not mean that it is an immediate solution. It means that it is, a viable way forward with challenging problems that are going to take some real creative problem solving. But what provides hope, however, is that our young people who are fighting for change, they travel to the far reaches of their imagination every day and find solutions for problems. It doesn't necessarily matter whether they subscribe to abstracted political or economic notions of democracy, justice, capitalism, communism, or even religion, karma, or magic. I mean, I think these categorical terms are often distractions. What is needed is good global governance, a strong regulatory regime, and economic interactions that works for people's health, well-being, the environment, and our ecological biodiversity as a whole. There will not be an economic miracle as long as neoliberal principles of privatization continue to militarize people's access from their environments and basic livelihood. It is absolutely evident that how we begin to heal this existential crisis is through restoring our ecological biodiversity while promoting people's interactions with their environments. That is the basis of a sound ecological system, of an ecological system. So how do we revise our ecological economic accounting paradigm? As mentioned, there are many methodologies and routes that can be utilized, and we should encourage indigenous and local methodologies to be explored. But we need to be clear that this does not include the privatization of environments by conservation cabals that end up privatizing technologies and surveillance, monitoring, protection, analytics, etc. Nor should we be valuing resources like water as commodities that can be traded in futures trades on Wall Street. So first and foremost, we should promote a transitional national accounting scheme that includes well-being while valuing the restoration of our ecological biodiversity. As part of the Reweaving Our Ecological Map program, our objectives were to reimagine the Pacific to restore our ecological biodiversity while supporting the developmental needs of our people. And that is what prompted this equation. And understanding the evolution of national accounting systems, there is no reason why states, regions, or cooperations should not participate in this transitional system, particularly if it is built upon principles that would reverse climate change, promote equitable development and well-being in the Pacific. So as we move forward, we realized that this equation could work across the ACP region and began to work on it on those terms, especially along the lines of equalization, debt reduction, labor, technology, governance and accountability, monitoring, reporting, and validation. And so then when COVID-19 hit, it became apparent that this too could work within a transitional system that allows for local communities to begin engaging in a much wider kind of global program. And we began to think about this as a translocal, interglobal initiative, and it got a lot more exciting and it began to feel more real and tangible. It's like a seed that we can plant and begin to reframe the global economy. I want to just say just so quick. So this is the equation that we're talking about. And again, while this tangible thing provides hope, I don't want to suggest that this is an easy solution. This will require work and mutual cooperation. And there are some who will obstruct any attempt to promote just and equitable governance, even at the risk of planetary existence. But understanding this, I think it's important that we talk about change. I don't want it to sound like an empty platitude, as I don't believe that there is that there's just one particular solution, especially one that can be implemented by a top-down consent process, but that I do believe in the heterogeneous, multifaceted relationship that Indigenous peoples, impacted people, poor people, traditional practitioners, customary communities can bring to the table. And of course, the challenge of telling the story in this really big context kind of scares the shit out of me, which is probably why it makes so much sense to talk about this in the context of the churches, because this is the people. So I just wanted to conclude by saying that this accounting equation is tangible and that we can, across various sectors, create intuitive biostatistical input-output tables and adjust how we use this data with double entry accounting procedures and so forth and so on. And anyway, the whole point is to do something just and equitable for people and planet. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ani, for those thought-provoking, very interesting, but again, acknowledging that we cannot move forward with this economic model at the expense of our environment, our ecology. But there's always the ways or alternative that you have offered through the ecological economic accounting on how best or how better ways, but better alternatives for us to look at this. Our fourth speaker, Ms. Daphne Kiki, is a graduate of the University of the South Pacific, a young woman from Bukawa, Morobe province in Papua New Guinea. She's currently pursuing further law studies at the University of Fiji. She's passionate about learning and growing in capacity building to help serve society more meaningfully in the hope of making a positive difference in people's lives. Ms. Daphne Kiki, welcome. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. My name is Daphne. I think my task is to give youth's voice on reviewing the ecological map. Reviewing the project that and the youth, the Pacific Island nations are not immune to globalization. This is why mind of how the Pacific is project and how we educate and influence this vulnerable but yet powerful group of people in our region is very important. We live in an era where Pacific youths can be easily and highly politicized or become politically active. So over the years, we have seen youths becoming more active in the local and international arena, standing and speaking up for environmental protection, climate change, and even political protest of government and democracy. Therefore, it is vital to inquire into the Pacific youth's consciousness and foresight of an identity and where they stand in everything that is happening around them. So the question here, our youth is questioning is, how do we reframe and influence a positive resilience culture among youths in our region, taking into consideration the consciousness of the situation, the transition, change, and how they would react to the changes around them. So in an attempt to answer this question, the Reweaving the Ecological Met Youth is looking to focus the initiative around three important areas of reframing, and that is in the Reweaving the Ecological Development Framework. These are based on the principles and values of the Reweaving the Ecological Map project and core areas of the Pacific society. We recognize that there is a disconnection between these areas in our society, our cultures and traditions, spirituality, indigenous and religious, economic development. So the culture and traditions are very important of our society. For the Pacific, our society has indigenous cultures and traditions, the local cultures and traditions, and the introduced cultures and traditions that is adapted over time. So we need to relook at the indigenous cultures and traditions and assess it against the cultures and traditions that is adapted over time and practice, which becomes our local cultures. These cultures and traditions influence the thought process of young people, how well they articulate and embrace these cultures will have an influence and impact on the development of our nations. Spirituality is also a big part of the indigenous community, especially in the Pacific. The spiritual well-being of young people will contribute to the resilience. Indigenous spirituality and religious spirituality play an important role in developing virtuous and moral leadership. How to differentiate but respect both spirituality in the growth and development of young people and our nations will be key in transforming our societies. The final aspect of reframing is economic development. With the REM framework, the REM youth is looking into how we could interpret the framework to youths, helping them to rethink the current development model and strive for a more sustainable development, a development model that is framed around our Pacific context, a development that is more viable for our people and community, one that strengthens the Pacific resilience towards change. And these have been included in the three Reweaving the Ecological Map publications that was launched last year, which was an essence of the inclusive discussion around the REM project and reframing, rethinking development. One of the books called From the Deep Pacific, Voices for a New Story contains visions from Pacific people from all walks of life on how they want to see development in the Pacific. That also includes visions from youth that how they would want to see development in the Pacific, a sustainable but a Pacific development that is not a Pacific development that works well for the Pacific as a whole. Thank you, Francis. I think I'll leave it for questions.
Thank you very much, Daphne. As a youth representative from the RAM youth, and also someone who has been behind the RAM project with the Institute of Mission and Research at the Pacific Theological College. You've highlighted the important role the young people play in this new narrative of reweaving the ecological net. And making sense of some of the existing framings that has existed in our culture, in our spirituality, and also even on our economic development, and being an active player in these reframing processes. Thank you again, Daphne, for that. a general, maybe a question to our guest speakers. Thank you again for all your opening remarks. How do you see, or how can you, we gift this ecological framework development to the world in light of the climate crisis, COVID-19, and other disasters and crises that we face? How do you see, or how can we gift this ecological development framework to the world in light of the crisis that we are all facing, COVID-19, climate crisis, economic, etc.? Dr. Cliff, you might want to unmute.
Yeah, thank you, moderator, for the question. I think I'll just make some brief comment, and the other panelists might also like to come in. First of all, I think there are, when we talk about the two-thirds world, as some people put in language, or the developing world, there are actually resonances of issues, of contexts that we have here in our region with the other regions. And so I think we do already have some common denominators in other contexts around the world. And I think this is where we can, share the wisdom that we have here with the other contexts that have similar issues, similar contexts, similar challenges that they are going through, where there are linkages, where there are connections. I think this is a rich area for sharing. And so that's one of those that I'd like to, first of all, mention. Secondly, and all the points that were raised, we do also have in the Ecological Framework for Development publication, as if I go back to what Annie and also the others, Elise have mentioned, the measures of well-being. And I think this is where we can also share our wisdom, our wealth to the world, is how we also propose that in this region there are very key factors, there are very key areas that are important, in fact extremely important for people in this region, that is nowhere covered under gross domestic product and even other forms of measuring wealth. And so I think this is an area that we can also share with the rest of the world, that what is important to us in measuring our wealth. And I think in one of the publications we highlight some of those important factors, some of those important areas that for our region are important as welfare measures. And I think these would also resonate quite a fair bit in similar contexts around. And so that's the second, the measures of well-being that we put out. And the final one that I thought I'd just like to mention also is that I think others will find useful the research methodology that we have also introduced in publication. Because the research methodology tries very much just to put in a method form what is actually perhaps a very common way of us talking and evaluating and reviewing and reflecting and constructing. So I think that's an area also that we can share. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Clifford. Anyone else from the... Annie?
Yes, in terms of answering a question in terms of how we gift the ecological framework, I did think that one of the first things that we could do is we could, if the Pacific were a sort of like a first mover, and to begin to, adopt portions of this equation as an accounting side table to to either like a national accounting or regional accounting system, I mean, that gift in itself would be amazing, because I think that that one of the things about the Pacific is that it is as a region, and especially because of the economics of scale, I do think that the Pacific is a really good ground to begin, exploring certain certain accounting methodologies, and much in the way that Daphne, spoke about it previously, where where we begin to look at indigenous communities and other sort of customary relations, and to begin this this accounting frame. And I think that in itself would be a tremendous gift. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. Elise?
Thanks, Francis. I actually see this more as part of a global movement where yes, maybe we can give something, but we also need to collaborate with others who are rethinking development, because yeah, we call ourselves large ocean states, and I think there's been a lot of work in the past 15, maybe more years of sort of reframing the representations of the Pacific, through the work of people like Epeli Haofa and others who've taken a stand about who we are as a region, and that as a region we're not going to be belittled and always called small island developing states, but we're going to reframe ourselves as large ocean states. And I think in a sense it's about representing oneself, or the region representing itself, and setting what I said earlier is sort of setting the parameters. And if a region that's been known for being small, isolated, place where you can put nuclear tests, you can do all kinds of experiments on people. If a region like that can say, no, hey, we're much more than that. We're large ocean states, and we're going to rethink how we want development based on our values, which are the cultural values, the theological values that Cliff talked about. And what's important, I think, in the discussion about the reframing the theology is that theology concords with the cultural values that Pacific societies hold dear, but that get forgotten or pushed aside in economic development models where individualism is promoted and so forth. And I know we're not talking about COVID today, but I participated in a socioeconomic impact assessment looking at social cohesion and community resilience. And the countries that had the least so I did 15 countries in the Pacific, and the countries that had the least global influence, or where the structures were more intact and people could come back together, probably fared better in terms of resilience and social cohesion, coming back together. And I think a lot of what we're trying to do with this project and this movement is say we can rebuild societies based on what's important to those societies. And And I think maybe that's, you know, if we're going to talk about a gift, maybe that's the gift, is to say, if we can do it, you know, if this region can do it, what's preventing other regions from doing it, from taking that stand? Yeah, so thanks.
Thank you, Alice. Daphne?
I think Dr. Cliff, Annie, and Alice has covered it. I think the gift of rethinking development is the gift that we're giving to the world, to be open and rethinking what development should look like for themselves and in their own contexts and regions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Daphne. Well, we've reached this point where we have, where we'll invite some brief comments and responses from other regions. I would like to invite Chenzo Greenage, excuse me if I've not pronounced that right.
Yes, that's right.
To maybe share brief comments or responses for
Okay,
our
thank you very much.
webinar.
Thank you so much, Francis. So I think I'm gonna situate myself. I'm actually speaking to you from the north of Quebec on Inuit territory, but my life has been kind of shared between Canada and the Caribbean. And my heritage, you can tell from my last name, or at least those who are familiar with the Caribbean, is linked to Barbados, to Guyana, and ultimately Trinidad, where my parents and grandparents live. So I'd just like to give a short life history of the Caribbean, because some of the questions that were presented by the speakers really caught my attention. A life history of the Caribbean. What would a social ontology coming from the Caribbean look like? You know, we're a collection of islands and South American nations, mainland nations like the Guyanas. But we also, in our material circumstances, have seen a history of exploitation that has created the replacement of many of our native flora and fauna by monoculture and by the import of flora and fauna from elsewhere to save the economy. That service to the economy has also affected our human relations, and we've had, you know, the replacement, physical, actual, and discursive of our indigenous peoples, and the organization of a kind of racial hierarchy that's really involved with capitalism. So both race, religion, law have all kind of been wrapped up in our economics, this economics of exploitation. Our nations have in many ways been drawn into monocultures, you know, starting from pearls to cotton to sugar, to gold to oil, and now to tourism. And when I come to the question of Dr. Huffer, when she was speaking about why do some of the other regions not take up this mantle, take up the initiatives that are happening in the Pacific, in many ways we've been in trying to qualify as nation states and trying to, you know, raise our GDPs to a first world level. Many of us have adopted the ideas of smallness in order to justify or create a relationship of dependence in some ways to, you know, old colonial powers and new ones. So I think in Temerate, accounting and reviewing the ecological map, what it inspires for us is ambition. And when I situate that in what is happening in the Caribbean, I look at the idea of reparations, which has really caught fire over the last 7-8 years. And I think what needs to happen in terms of our experience is that we draw from the idea that we're not creating a just economy out of nothing. We're creating it from a history that has seen both the environment and the people exploited. And so the idea of how to move forward should come from really reckoning with that history, reckoning with what is possible when the value, the inherent intrinsic value of both people and the environment are not recognized, and then moving from there to really build something that represents a kind of grounded theory of justice. That's not a thought experiment, but really operating from a veil of knowledge of what has happened to us in the past. I think I'll leave it there. I think that's my 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Genzo. I now would like to invite Colin Shava from All Africa Conference of Churches.
Thank you.
From the Africa region.
Thank you, Frances, and thank you everyone for the quite interesting discussions that have been raised. And I'm very intrigued with some of the questions that have been raised in this webinar. And I see connections. I'll just try to locate myself as well. My name is Collins from the AACC, but I'm Zimbabwean, and I've lived all my life in Zimbabwe and Kenya. So I'll just come in a little bit with trying to make the connections with this discussion and what is happening in the Pacific region, where I see the connections with our African continent in terms of how we view the neoliberal economic model, which has caused significant changes and problems for us as a continent for a very, very long time. I locate my people as well as being exploited, and also our land and our resources being exploited without the benefit of the people and without the benefit of the environment in Africa. And I want to locate my continent in terms of how extractivism happens here in Africa because of the economic models that we are using. The amount of extractivism that happens here of natural resources that we have and mineral resources that we have is quite happening at an astonishing level, which does not replenish our ecological environment, and it has caused problems both for the society, because we don't benefit from the extractives revenue. We don't benefit from the mining of minerals in our continent, but they are benefiting other large corporations and others which connive with governments to work in their countries and also extract resources without replenishing the environment. This has created also a gap between the rich and the poor in the continent, which dates back to even the colonial period, and the same neoliberal policies that we have been following, and also some of the blanket ones that have been imposed on Africa, have also ensured that the poor remain poor and the richer become richer at the expense of the environment. So I would like to just point out to 3 issues that relate to this webinar. One of them is that the issues of the neoliberal model of economy, which has been part of and parcel of our long time African society, with the policies being implemented. There's something wrong with that, and we need something which is a little bit new and a little bit more radical to ensure that we can change that outcome. And also, it is also dating back to the issues of colonialism, where who owns the land in Africa? Because if you see that even years after independence, there are still minority groups which hold African land in Africa. And it is quite astonishing that those people control the resources of the people, and they control what happens, our relationship with the ecology. And that is something we should change. And we need something a little bit more radical that can be able to ensure that we as Africans can participate in our land, in the issues of our land, in issues of our environment, and also take charge of replenishing our environment. And I also want to raise that there's a question which was raised by, I think, Alice. She was talking about why we are not taking up initiatives as this one, which we are seeing in the Pacific region, which is quite important. But I also want to locate that our African society generally, we are a little bit disconnected from issues of ecological issues. Why I say so, we don't put them at a priority level. We know them, but we can't put them at a priority level because there are issues of bread and butter that we need to take up for. We need to look for. As much as I can say, I can speak from my context in Zimbabwe, that the issues of environment, the issues of ecology, how we locate ourselves in the ecosystem, is not really a priority issue because of bread and butter issues that we think about every day. But that means that we need to do as churches, that we need to take up an initiative like this one to ensure that we change the mindset of the people, and build a movement of people who are conscious about their environment and people who can locate themselves in the interconnectedness of the ecosystem, people who can locate themselves away from consumerism, away from capitalist tendencies. So we need to build something around that, and it will take something more new and more radical from us, even the churches, the youth, and so forth, that we can change that mindset and really focus on how we can take this up. And also there's an issue of disunity amongst African states as well, to really locate themselves in the issues of the ecology and the environment. And I think these are some of the issues that we need to connect and to ensure that as an African continent, what are we saying about our land? What are we saying about extractivism? What are we saying about the environment? To have that singular voice that can also make us respond to global issues as one. I think my 3 minutes are up, but thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Collins, Shava. I now would like to welcome Jene Paita from the Protestant Church in Maluku, Indonesia. Welcome, Jenny.
Thank you, Athena and Francis. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity. I am Jana Peter from Indonesia, Protestant Church of Maluku. I'm from East Indonesia, from Maluku Province. My comment is also always some with all my concern, and always over and over, I always say this loud. How the theology framing about ecology is skewed from the indigenous perspective, because there are many ecology are developed and expand from the Western culture. Even if we have many eco-theology developed from our culture, especially from Asia and especially from Indonesia, but also always sometimes the framing of indigenous people is just to show. It just points some particle, maybe little particle, to attempt that there are ecology theology, but they don't dig more and and find how the ecology theology is framing from 100% from indigenous people. I'm working with indigenous people. Sometimes I feel hopeless when we try to create one step to build the community and also the economic based on the indigenous people, but there are already 100 steps from the modern economy hit us. So how I feel that sometimes we feel very far from what we dreaming, what we frame about ecology, theology, and it is possible because there are many discussion. We already building, we are well built. There's some advocates and anything, but it's still it's still there. It's still not enough. And how the pandemic is hit her hit us very hard. Uh, the pandemic sometimes also makes some stigma for the indigenous people, especially we people living in the jungle, because we know how we living with our consuming some of the food, and how the stigma is stick with the indigenous people. When we want to come to the town, and people already, the modern people already make a stigma that we are the people from the indigenous people who living in the jungle already. We are the creator of the COVID-19 and everything. And so that's my question for all speakers. Thank you for all the speakers' knowledge, wonderful sharing for us and the knowledge. But my question, how possible we create 100% a framework and methodology from indigenous people? Because the focus of indigenous people who see that community as an equal, not separate. Our thinking of cosmology is also whole. It's also one aspect. We don't have a different perspective about that we are different from the nature. That so if I am living in Ambon Island in Maluku, I'm connect with all people around because our perspective about the ocean connect us, and the weather, the wind is also connect. How we thinking about everything. That's I will leave it there, and that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. We've heard from the three different regions plus the Pacific region, and we've also probably identified some commonalities from all these different regions, and ways that we can actually work together and help each other in addressing or pushing this new narrative that we want forward. So we'll now open the floor for any questions from the audience to our guest speakers. And I believe Jenny earlier had also asked the question of how can we get 100% methodology structure from our indigenous community. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Jenny. I didn't hear that question quite clearly. But the floor now is open to our audience if you wish to pose any question for our guest speakers. Vinaka.
So,
Can I?
Oh,
Okay.
Is it okay for me to talk?
Go ahead, Alice.
Okay. Just in response to Jenna's question, or it was what Jenna said was very moving, because we could feel the sort of not despair, but how hard it is. And in our context, the region, the indigenous people are in a majority. So in a sense, it's, even though it's still a struggle to in the economic development model to you know, have cultural values at the heart of the culture of the economic model. We're a long ways from that, but that's what we're aiming for. But it's easier because the cultural context is a majority cultural context. In Jenny's case, it's from what I can understand, it's a more of a minority context. But what I would hope that would come out of this webinar and then further work on in this area is to be able to support, you know, to have support systems and networks with indigenous communities that are struggling to set the framework against, you know, I guess dominant other dominant communities. And so what I would hope is that through an ongoing movement, we can you know, bring in more indigenous communities and keep building up the movement, and hopefully also with the ecological accounting, which integrates cultural values and values of relationships and of oneness with the environment and so forth, that can be then used by indigenous communities in other regions.
Thank you, Alice. Yes, Seraphim Metropolitan. You have
thank you very much. I confused a little the time, but I'm going to put also my question, and then the panelists, they can reply together to all of them. So in the WCC, we managed to give a special position to somebody to represent the indigenous people in the Central Committee and also in the other structures of the WCC. And also I realized that the same situation is happening in the meetings of the COPs. They have a special participation. And also one of my friends, Dr. Nigel, who was involved for the indigenous people for many years, now he's in UNESCO and he's the voice of the indigenous people. So my question to the panelists was what coordination there is, all these people who represent the indigenous people in the international forums and in other reporter forums like the WCC, in the human rights, they come together, all these people, to have one voice, to change views, and to coordinate their ministry to protect the rights of the indigenous people. Because today, the number one victims of the pandemic are the indigenous people. Because, for example, in Zimbabwe, because of also of the military regime and all of these problems, many people, they have just only one day a job to have some income. When there is a lockdown because of the pandemic, they don't have any income. So they don't have anything to eat. And I think the situation is the same in countries suffering of poverty. And the places where the indigenous people live are in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So what is the role of these people represent the indigenous people in international forums to come together and to coordinate, to be the voice for change of the rights of the indigenous people? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Does any of the speakers like to respond to that? Maybe I can also, there's also other questions on the chat box that I will share with you all. Annie, you wanted to respond?
Oh yes, I did wanted to respond, and I guess this is in regard to both Jenny's point as well as Serafim Kaikotis, and I do think that with this sort of like accounting mechanism that we're talking about, or that I've been talking about, it's there isn't I feel as though there's a strong alignment with free, prior, and informed consent. And I think that one of the problems with FPIC is that there's this tendency to try to kind of mainframe it and streamline this consent process. And so there's still this notion that even with the recognition of FPIC, that there's still going to be some kind of a top-down allocation of information or consent processes, I suppose. And I think that one of the strategies that that I would love to see more of is really the process by which people develop their own, indigenous peoples develop their own methodologies in order to participate within this sort of like larger what I would what I'd like to call it a trans-local or interglobal like context. But this does bring about like other issues about like how indigenous peoples see themselves within the context of the global economy, or within a very simply within their own their own particular system. And I do think that at least from someone who's who a while ago, but participated at the permanent forum, I do get this sense that this idea of translocalism is something that's very, very profound. But the question has always been is how do we address FPIC in the larger context? So that's it.
Thank you, Annie. Ladies and gentlemen, I've just been reminded we have 5 minutes left. Maybe we'll just ask, we'll just have one last question. What are you doing is so important. This is from Arthur. What are you doing? What you are doing is important. How can you reach beyond the churches to a wider audience? If we can keep the answer short, how can we reach beyond the churches to a wider audience?
I have a really short answer to Arthur's question, simply because I know him in another context, but he's participating in another working group in looking to address some of these very same issues to the G20. And so I guess this question becomes how do we talk about this in the context of the G20 or the G8 or in the other institutions. So that's
it. Yeah. Maybe just to add to that, and maybe Elise and can elaborate on this a bit more. But with this movement, I think it's also the attempts to take this beyond the churches has started off in small ways. The youth wing, they engaged with university in PNG, and then also here in Solomon Islands, in Fiji, and then with the engagement with the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, with the launching and having this presented to that regional organization. So there's already some small movements towards that, but I think a lot more needs to be done.
Thank you, Dr. Cliff Bird.
Yeah, so very quickly, I mean, Cliff talked about we have quite a strong regional architecture. So For us, we've been looking at ways to get through our regional organizations and those who have political power and influence. I think it's really important. I think Reverend Dr. Dietrich added some, a comment about similar approaches for new ecological development framework. I think, this work really needs to link into other similar efforts. There is a global movement towards rethinking how we measure things and what we value. So this movement of reweaving the ecological mat and the development framework, ecological development framework, need to be publicized, and we need to collaborate with other organizations and individuals and movements that are thinking along the same lines and that are looking for solutions, so that we can share these and have a stronger collective voice. So definitely we've already gone beyond churches. We're trying to influence there's quite a strong conservation of nature movement in the Pacific. So we're working with them to see how we can collaborate and along with political leaders who are interested in taking this up as well.
Thank you very much, Alice. Thank you again to all our guest speakers. Before it's quite unfortunate that time is catching up on us. While there's a lot that we wanted to discuss, I would like to invite Daphne Kiki to read for us a poem before we wrap this webinar. Daphne. Daphne, I think we can't hear you.
Okay, the poem I'm going to read to you all is the poem titled "The Language of Trees and Clams" by Wardley D. Berry Igivisa. You can find this poem in the publication from the BIP, the Pacifica Voices for a New Story. So the poem reads, "When my father cuts down trees to plant yams, he speaks to them. He summons the spirits and they reason beside the mumu pit. At harvest, he gets enough for a meal. When my mother goes out to fish for clams, she sings a song. She sings softly, sweetly. Then she swims into the heart of the sea and brings back home just enough for a meal. We have an understanding, us and them. The land, the sea, and our fathers are one. We have farmed this land for 1,000 suns, and we have harvest not to hoard, but to heal. But the spirits left when the machines came, and with them the language of trees and clams." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daphne, for that lovely poem. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our webinar. I would like to thank everyone who had made this webinar possible. I would also special thank you to our speakers, Reverend Dr. Cliff Bird, Alice Herfer, Anis Saiki, and Daphne Kiki. But once again, thank you all for joining us today. Nisam Modemanda.